Good afternoon and welcome to Washington Week's new digital show, Washington Week Recommends. I'm Yamiche Alcindor. This show is about recommending great reporting that I think deserves your attention. So every Friday at 12:30 p.m. Eastern, mark your calendars, I'll be talking to journalists behind important pieces of work. Today we'll be talking about Republican governors flying migrants into Democrat-run cities and immigration policy. And this week, Florida's Governor Ron Desantis made headlines when he threatened to send a plane of migrants to President Biden's home state of Delaware. This comes, of course, days after DeSantis sent dozens of migrants on private planes to the popular vacation island of Martha's Vineyard. Now, Gillian Brockell, a reporter for the Washington Post, wrote about the parallels between the transportation of migrants to Democrat-led cities and white segregationists in 1962, dropping off black families in Cape Cod in retaliation for civil rights protests. The headline of the article is, quote, "Reverse Freedom Rides," an echo of Martha's Vineyard's migrant flights 60 years ago. And Gillian joins me now. So thank you so much for being here. Tell people about what is going on as it relates to sort of reverse freedom rides, what happened with reverse freedom rides, and why you wanted to write about that.
Sure. So the reverse freedom rides happened in 1962. They were a year after the freedom rides that we know much better from civil rights history, where black and white volunteers were taking interstate buses through the South to desegregate them. So segregationists in the South wanted to, retaliate, pull a prank. And so what they did is they advertised free trips to the north, to northern cities, to any African Americans who wanted to go. And they intentionally chose people that they thought would be least welcomed when they arrived at their new destination. So they picked single mothers with a lot of children. They advertised in prisons so that men coming out of prison would volunteer. And they paid for these these bus rides to the north. Now, they deceived these people and told them that they would be going to a city of their choice, and that when they arrived, President Kennedy himself would be welcoming them. They were told not to pack anything because everything would be provided when they arrived in these places. And none of that was true. For the most of the reverse freedom riders were sent to Hyannisport in Cape Cod, very near to President Kennedy's holiday home. And so it's so striking, the similarities with what has happened in Martha's Vineyard with Governor DeSantis sending these migrants there. Martha's Vineyard, of course, former President Obama has a holiday home there. And, these people were deceived and told that they were going somewhere else and just dropped there with the intention of creating a disturbance and sort of exposing the hypocrisy of left-wing people who would support the migrants.
The similarities, especially as you describe them, are just so striking. You write specifically about Victoria Bell, who is this woman whose photo is at the top of your article for the Washington Post. We might be able to show it to folks. Tell me a little bit about how her story unfolded. What did you learn about her?
Her story is probably one of the happiest ending stories. She was a 38-year-old single woman with 11 children. And she accepted one of these reverse freedom rides. She was dropped off in Hyannisport, and there was media there to see at her arrival. So there are lots of photos. And she actually, so most of the reverse freedom riders, when they arrived, were welcomed with open arms. Now, they arrived in the summertime when Hyannisport is full of people at their holiday homes. So they had no trouble finding work, finding accommodation, and assistance. Now, as the season ended, most of the reverse freedom riders ended up going to Boston or to other places to find work. And they were also sent to a military base nearby, which is also the military base that the migrants are now being sent to 60 years later. In any case, Victoria Bell is the only one that appears to have stayed forever in Hyannisport. She found work first in a laundry and eventually became a nurse to the elderly. She appears in the local newspaper quite a bit over the years, and it's always positive stories. It's her kids are on the honor roll. She's volunteering for this. She's volunteering for that. She clearly was very well loved in her in Hyannis, in her adopted city, and she died at 76 in 2000. Was given a glowing obituary by the local newspapers, and some of her children still live in the area.
Wow. How typical, you say she had one of the happiest endings. How typical was her story, given sort of what we know about the other people?
It's hard to track down all of the people that this happened to. In the end, there were only about 200 of these reverse freedom riders. A lot of them, we haven't been able to track down what happened to them. But, in contrast to Victoria's story, there's also another woman named Leila Mae Williams. She arrived, I believe, with 8 children or 9 children. And, as the season ended, she and her family went to Boston looking for work. And they really had a hard time there. They ended up in public housing. They experienced a lot of racism. When they arrived in public schools, they were bused and, experienced a lot of the retaliation that people had against the busing program. And, some of them struggled with drugs, and, some of them have had really difficult lives.
That's really, really heartbreaking. I was going to ask you about Ms. Williams, and I want to point out and read to folks some of the parts of your article that I thought were most striking. You write, quote, many of the white segregationists, quote, focused on recruiting men with criminal records and single mothers with a lot of children, cynically presuming white liberals would welcome them the least. And you, of course, talk about Ms. Williams there. I wonder, I have 2 questions here. The first one I'll ask you is, what are the parallels do you think you see in terms of who is being sent to these places and the ideas that people might have about who these people are in terms of worth and value?
Yeah, I mean, it's really gross that they sort of intentionally picked people that they thought would create problems up north, that, these women with a lot of children would be a burden on welfare programs, or that these men that were coming out of prison would, continue their criminal careers in the North. From what I've been able to tell, that didn't happen at all. Everyone was welcomed with open arms, including the men. There's one man there's a photograph of him in my story. His name escapes me at the moment, but he ended up opening a restaurant, and he was housed in a private home immediately upon his arrival. And so, like I said, in the short term, these people were welcomed with open arms. And that's why the program failed, because the supposed hypocrisy was not exposed. Now, long term, there could have been better support for them. And also, President Kennedy really avoided speaking about it or intervening in any way, like he did with a lot of civil rights things. And yeah.
I also want to read another part of your article. You write, quote, white Southern segregationist groups badly deceived Black families. The Greater New Orleans Citizens Council ran a newspaper ads in 1962 promising, quote, free transportation plus $5 for expenses to any Negro man or woman or family, no limit to the size, who desire to migrate to the nation's capital or any city in the North of their choosing. There were notices posted, you said, in prisons offering transportation to prisoners whose sentences were set to expire. When you look at those ads, what did your reporting reveal about the motivations behind that? And what was it like just to see those ads and realize just sort of the deception that was being used in that moment?
Well, it's just so cruel. It's just so cruel. The sort of expectation that, well, I don't want these people in my community, so others won't, reveals more about the people sending the reverse freedom riders than the people who received them.
You also, you mentioned the idea that there were only about 200 of these people on the reverse freedom rides. Our reporting shows that more than 230 buses carrying nearly 9,400 migrants, including families with young children, have arrived in D.C. and maybe other cities as well, of course, because we've seen people go to Martha's Vineyard in terms of flying. What do you make of the scale of what's happening now, given what we know about how those reverse freedom riders failed? What do you make of the scale of what's happening right now?
I mean, it's not just the scale to me. It's also that the governors who are sending these people are not warning the cities that these people are coming. And that's what's creating a bigger crisis. I think most people, there have been a flood of migrants to the border, and these are legal asylum seekers, we should note. And you know, I don't think it's unreasonable that a governor would want other places to share with the resource allocation of accommodating these people. However, the fact that they're not warning anyone that these people are coming makes it a bigger crisis in them arriving, and is very intentional and is all part of the gimmick. And interestingly, it's something that the citizens councils and segregationists in the South didn't do with the reverse freedom riders. The people in Hyannis knew that these buses were coming and were able to prepare. They had what they called refugee committees that were, you know, local left-wing religious people, Unitarians and such, meeting these people at the buses. You know, when the people who are dropped off in front of Vice President Kamala Harris's home, you know, there was no one there to greet them because no one had been told they were coming.
It's striking to think about the fact that white segregationists were giving heads up, even if they were doing something that a lot of people would see as amoral. They were at least giving a heads up, where now you're not hearing about those cities getting a heads up. I also want to ask you, when we look at this, you think about the motivations, because you mentioned the idea of intentions. When you look at the motivations of these citizens councils in the 1960s, and then you look at the motivations of the Republican governors, including Ron DeSantis, what do you think is the overlap there? What's the connection?
I mean, the connection is not treating human beings as human beings, but as pawns. There have been a lot of officials who have been critical of Governor DeSantis using that exact word. And when I was reading old coverage of these reverse freedom rides, it was the exact same word. They're using human beings as pawns. You know, it's another thing that's strange to me is that DeSantis and Governor Abbott haven't really learned the available lesson that could be learned from these reverse freedom rides, because they failed, because the people who arrived were received well. And they also really alienated a lot of moderate people that maybe do have a problem with immigration, but don't want to see people dehumanized like this. And I should say, you know, my colleague Jody Tillman, who researched this story with me, she found a Gallup poll from 1962 of white Southerners, and most of them disapproved of these reverse freedom rides. So even people who could be pro-segregation or, you know, not generally feel warmly about African Americans in their community, even those people thought this is not a great thing to do. And that's something that you're seeing now today as well.
And I want to allow you to talk about the big differences here, because you pointed them out. They're striking differences. Talk to us a little bit about that.
I mean, like I said, the one striking difference is the warning that the receiving parties were given that these people were coming. That has not happened today. The other thing is taking credit. These rides were funded and organized by citizens councils, but the people in those citizens councils, for the most part, wanted to remain anonymous. They did not want to take public credit for this. Many of them sent letters to government officials in Hyannis, sort of laughing and taking credit and saying racist things, but they didn't sign them. They were completely anonymous. And here you see Governors DeSantis and Abbott falling over themselves to take credit. And using public monies to do it too, which is something completely different from what happened in 1962.
And I also want to talk to you, what do you think could be the legal consequences here when we think about the migrants? Because we know that the Freedom Riders never sought or even received compensation.
Right. Yeah. One of the reasons in 1962 that President Kennedy declined to help the state of Massachusetts when their governor requested help was that no laws were broken as far as he could see. Every American citizen has the right to, cross state lines, and, they were deceived, and he called it, a cheap trick. But no laws were broken. I'm not a lawyer, so I can't comment on the legality today, but I have been listening to a lot of lawyers, and I know that they will be exploring everything they can in terms of possible laws broken. What seems clear is that regardless of if anybody is charged with anything who arranged this, it's not going to be a sort of slam dunk case.
We have about a minute left, so I want to ask you one other thing, which is what does the conclusion of this what might the conclusion of this look like, given what happened with the reverse Freedom Riders?
Well, right now, the migrants are in the same place that a lot of the reverse Freedom Riders ended up at the end of the summer. Like I said, when they arrived in Hyannisport, they were put up in private homes and in a college dormitory. And when the season ended, they were transferred to a military base. That's where the migrants are now. They are at this military base. They clearly have very good legal representation, as we've seen from a lot of the clips of attorneys swirling around on Twitter. In terms of what happens to them, I think the one thing that I would say in relation to what happened in 1962 is that those who want to support these new arrivals, it's a long-term project. The reverse Freedom Riders who did not do as well, the support was temporary. And when they got to Boston, when they moved around to a different city, they didn't find the support and the welcome that they found in Hyannis.
In the last few seconds we have here, we're obviously recommending your reporting for people to take a listen to and to watch, I should say, and to read. The other thing that's here, there are people that are Metropolitan reporters. You're a Retropolitan reporter. So tell us a little bit about Retropolis reporters.
Yeah.
I kept on trying to figure out how to say that. Explain to people what that is and sort of what they will get when they're looking at your reporting.
Sure. So Retropolis is the history section of the Washington Post. A lot of different Post reporters and freelancers write for it. I have the distinct honor of being the only staff writer who only writes for Retropolis. And all we write about is history and how it relates to the news of the day. And some of that is retelling stories that you thought you knew. Some of that is telling stories that you had never heard of that have insane parallels to what is happening today. And it's the best job in the world. And it's a great beat. And I invite anyone to come and read our section. We love it.
Well, thank you so much for joining us and for sharing your reporting. I'm really, really excited to have you on as our debut guest. Thanks for watching, of course, our debut for all of you who are watching out there of our new digital show, Washington Week Recommends. You can find us here every Friday at 12:30 p.m. Eastern. Again, mark your calendars. And of course, be sure to tune in to Washington Week tonight on PBS. We'll discuss a lot of things, including former President Trump's mounting legal challenges and new threats from Russia as it continues its war in Ukraine. Thank you again. We'll see you this evening.